You know that moment when a single, casual sentence from someone you love feels less like words and more like a physical blow to the chest? I do. I lived it. My own flesh and blood, my 20-year-old daughter, Chloe, looked me straight in the eye across a perfectly good Sunday dinner I had spent 5 hours preparing and called me old and pathetic. Not in a joking way, not in a teenage huff, but with a cold, condescending finality that said she truly meant it, every syllable dripping with judgment and contempt. It wasn't just about my age. It was a brutal, surgical dismissal of my entire life, my career, my modest home, and every single sacrifice I had made for her future. She expected me to wilt, to cry, maybe to yell, and then inevitably cave in, because that was the dynamic we had operated under for years. She certainly didn't expect the quiet, earth-shattering decision I made that night, a decision that would surgically unravel her carefully constructed, entitled world in a matter of weeks and force her to face a terrifying reality I had shielded her from for a decade. Was I wrong to teach her a lesson that harsh? Was it cruel to finally put my own needs first after 2 decades of self-effacement for her benefit? Tell me if you would have simply let that stand, absorbing the insult and continuing to fund the contempt, or if you would have fought back, not with anger, but with the necessary, painful truth of financial independence. To understand the magnitude of that moment, you have to understand the decade that led up to it, and especially Chloe's chilling evolution from a sweet, vulnerable little girl into the entitled, dismissive young woman sitting across my mahogany dining table. My name is Mark, and I'm 52 years old, and until that moment, my entire adult identity was wrapped up in being a single father. My career was solid, not spectacular. I was a mid-level manager at a regional logistics company. Good benefits, stable pay, absolutely no glamour. My wife, Sarah, Chloe's mother, left us when Chloe was just 10. Sarah was brilliant, ambitious, and ultimately, she felt our quiet, comfortable suburban life was a prison. She chased a high-powered career across the country and, little by little, phased herself entirely out of our lives. It was devastating, not just for me, but for Chloe, who internalized the abandonment. I watched my 10-year-old daughter withdraw, her eyes shadowed with the pain of feeling unwanted by one parent. I felt a fierce, burning, protective instinct rise up in me. I swore that Chloe would never lack for anything, especially stability and opportunity. I made a solemn pact with myself. I would be the rock that her mother had failed to be. My job offered several pathways to significant promotion, opportunities that would have included travel, long hours, and the 6-figure salary that Sarah had always chased. But I turned them all down. Every single one. I prioritized being home at 5:30 p.m., making dinner, supervising homework, and being physically and emotionally present. I poured every ounce of my energy, every dollar of my discretionary savings, and every shred of my own ambition into her. My life became an exercise in extreme financial conservatism and self-sacrifice. I drove a 10-year-old Honda with a persistent squeak in the engine and a duct-taped bumper so that I could put money into a high-interest college fund for her. I skipped vacations for years. My last trip was a camping trip with Sarah before the divorce. The money saved went toward expensive summer camps, private tutoring when she struggled with geometry, or the latest fashionable clothing item she felt she absolutely needed to fit in with her more affluent peer group. My wardrobe consisted of comfortable, practical clothes, the definition of the dad uniform, because every dollar that wasn't strictly necessary for bills was earmarked for her. I became her chauffeur, her banker, her chef, and, tragically, her emotional punching bag, all wrapped up in a slightly rumpled, aging package. I genuinely believed that my sacrifices were building her future, and that somewhere, deep down, she understood the immense cost of the foundation she was standing on. Fast forward 10 years to the current year. Chloe was now a sophomore in college, attending a very prestigious and incredibly expensive private university in the city, an hour and a half away. I was the sole provider for everything. The $60,000 annual tuition bill, the rent on her trendy, off-campus apartment that she insisted was necessary, her utility bills, a generous monthly allowance that covered food, books, and entertainment, and the car payment for the almost new sedan I bought her, so she wouldn't have to navigate the city's public transport. The financial strain was immense. I was consistently overdrafting my accounts just days before my paycheck hit, and I had started taking on freelance accounting work late at night just to keep the entire structure from collapsing. She rarely visited, usually only for obligatory holidays, and those visits were often fraught with tension, characterized by her impatience to leave and her barely disguised contempt for our modest, suburban home. She had fully absorbed the ethos of her elite college environment, the importance of brand names, exclusive social clubs, and the subtle, relentless pressure to appear successful, sophisticated, and, most importantly, wealthy. Her new friends, whose parents were mostly CEOs, high-powered lawyers, and successful entrepreneurs, drove luxury cars and wore clothes that cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. Chloe, desperate and insecure, quickly developed an entitlement that was frankly sickening to witness. When she called, it was rarely to check in on me. It was to ask for more money. The requests were always framed as non-negotiable emergencies: a mandatory study abroad application fee, a suddenly broken, high-end laptop, or the need for a specific, expensive dress for a networking gala she claimed was crucial for her future. I always grumbled, always felt a cold knot of anxiety about stretching my already threadbare budget, but I always provided. I saw it as the final phase of my commitment. I was nearing the finish line. I was getting closer to seeing her graduate, to seeing my 2-decade investment pay off in a successful, happy adult. I was operating on fumes and a decade of utterly deferred dreams, but I kept pushing forward. I truly, desperately believed that she, at least on some basic human level, respected the Herculean effort, even if she lacked the grace to express it. The setting for the ultimate, life-altering confrontation was quiet, domestic, and utterly normal, which only served to amplify the cruelty. She came home for a 3-day weekend, but not, as she reluctantly admitted after a few leading questions, to see me. She was actually meeting a friend in a neighboring suburb for a concert, but figured she'd swing by for dinner since she was in the area. I, being the pathetic, eager father she saw me as, was still thrilled. I spent the entire afternoon cooking her favorite meal: slow-roasted lamb, infused with rosemary and garlic, buttery smashed potatoes, and a perfect, layered chocolate torte for dessert. I set the table with the good china, the kind we only brought out for special occasions. When she arrived, complaining loudly about the speed and how she needed to upload something immediately, she spent the entire, meticulously prepared meal scrolling through her phone, giving one-word, distracted answers to my questions about her classes, her job prospects, and her general well-being. The conversation that finally detonated the bomb started innocently enough, a typical dad moment. I was telling her about my upcoming annual work review, mentioning that my boss had praised my consistency, my reliability, and that I was looking forward to the modest year-end bonus, which I planned to use to finally replace my worn-out living room sofa. I was genuinely proud of my stability, proud of how I'd managed to keep our boat steady and afloat for all these years, despite the storms. Then, she looked up from her phone. She didn't look angry. She looked utterly, profoundly bored, and entirely dismissive. She sighed, a big, dramatic puff of air that communicated a vast ocean of disappointment, and pushed her plate away, still half full of the lamb I'd spent all afternoon basting and tending to. Dad, honestly, do you ever get tired of being so small? The question hung in the air, acidic and sharp, cutting through the pleasant aroma of the roast. I felt my face flush. I stammered, "Small? What do you mean, Chloe? My company is a billion-dollar operation. I'm a good manager." She rolled her eyes, a gesture that had become routine but suddenly felt like a physical slap across the face. "I mean, look at you," she sneered, making a sweeping gesture around our perfectly clean but undeniably dated kitchen. "Look at this house. Look at your job. You're 52 and you're excited about a modest bonus and a new sofa at a boring logistics job. You're talking about consistency. My friend Madison's dad is 48 and he just sold his second tech startup for millions. He flies private. He talks about investments and legacy. You drive a 10-year-old Honda and wear those same awful, faded cargo shorts you've had since I was in middle school. You're always talking about stability and sacrifices. Honestly, Dad, you're just old and pathetic. The words, delivered with the cold confidence of a judge reading a guilty verdict, echoed in the sudden, shattering silence. It wasn't the words themselves, though they were cruel enough to be devastating. It was the absolute, utter conviction behind them. The fact that she viewed me as a failure, a cautionary tale, purely because I hadn't chased a fortune, purely because I had chosen her over wealth. She was casually, brutally judging my life's singular focus, which, in the most painful irony, was her. All the late nights, the skipped meals, the financial anxiety I swallowed to pay for her life, her prestige, and her comfort, it was all reduced to a pathetic, self-inflicted failure in her eyes. I felt a glacial, frightening calm wash over the initial shock, a terrible clarity born of pure, distilled devastation. I looked at her, this beautiful, privileged, entirely self-absorbed stranger sitting across from me, and for the first time in 10 years, I didn't see my little girl. I saw a monster of my own making, an expensive pet I had overfed on entitlement. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. My reaction was a complete subversion of everything she had ever known and expected from me. I simply stood up, slowly, pushing back my chair with a deliberate, grating scrape against the hardwood floor. My hands were shaking, yes, but not with fear or sorrow. It was the intense vibration of a decade of suppressed anger and self-denial finally cracking the surface. My voice, when it came out, was low, dangerously quiet, and entirely devoid of the warmth she was accustomed to. "Go to your room, Chloe. Now." She scoffed, her phone still clutched in her hand, utterly incredulous. "My room? Dad, I'm 20. I have an apartment in the city, and I'm meeting Madison in 2 hours. You're losing it." "This is my house," I interrupted, my eyes locked on hers, forcing her to finally look away from her screen. "You are under my roof for 3 days, and until you learn some basic human respect for the man who paid for the roof over your other head, you will do exactly what I say. Go. Now." No debate, no discussion. For the first time, she saw a flicker of something she hadn't anticipated, a cold, hard steel spine she thought I had lost years ago in the endless pursuit of her happiness. Her confusion momentarily eclipsed her anger. She huffed, snatched her expensive backpack off the floor, and stomped upstairs, her heavy footsteps a final, petulant punctuation mark on the ruin of our dinner. I didn't follow her. I stayed in the dining room, surrounded by the remnants of the ruined meal, the perfectly roasted lamb and the uneaten tort, which felt like a heartbreaking metaphor for our shattered relationship. I cleared the table meticulously, mechanically, washing the dishes with a deliberate, grinding focus, turning the physical labor into a meditation on what I had to do next. I knew, with absolute, terrifying certainty, that if I let this go, if I simply paid her next month's rent and forgave the insult, I would be signing my own psychological death warrant. I would truly become the pathetic man she saw. I went straight to my computer, the glow of the screen the only light in the kitchen. My fingers trembled slightly as I logged into my primary bank accounts. This wasn't a rash decision born of momentary rage. It was the final, inevitable conclusion of a decade of painful self-reflection, triggered by her cruel final judgment. I started the surgical process of excision. First, I canceled the recurring monthly transfer for her off-campus apartment rent. Then, the car payment transfer. Then, the generous monthly allowance for living expenses. Finally, the big one, the quarterly tuition payment for her elite university, which was due in 3 weeks. I didn't just stop the transfers. I systematically and permanently closed the dedicated college savings account and the various emergency funds I had maintained for her. I then transferred the remaining, considerable balance, the life savings I had bled for over 10 years, into a new, locked retirement account under my name. The whole process took maybe 15 minutes, but it felt like signing a stack of divorce papers. I was shaking from the intensity of the action. Yes, but there was also a grim, exhilarating resolve blooming in my chest. A decade of suffocating obligation lifted, replaced by a dizzying rush of reclaimed autonomy. I was done being her pathetic ATM. I was done sacrificing my entire future for her ungrateful, entitled present. I was going to sacrifice her present for my future. The money wasn't gone. It was simply being redirected to the person who had actually earned it, me. The next morning, she came downstairs precisely at 11 a.m., still clearly, and you won't be taking the train back to the city today or any other day soon. She glared, folding her arms across her chest in an aggressive, defiant stance. What are you talking about? I have a party tonight, I have study groups tomorrow, and I have a lecture series. Stop being dramatic and take me. This is ridiculous. I slowly lowered my newspaper, resting my elbows on the table, giving her my full, unwavering attention. You called me old and pathetic, Chloe. You judged my life based entirely on money and external, shallow success. You dismissed every single sacrifice I made, every opportunity one passed up, every 10-year-old car I drove, every pair of cargo shorts I wore, to ensure you had a better, easier, more prestigious life than I did. That better life, Chloe, was built entirely on my pathetic stability, on those modest bonuses, and on the fact that I was willing to destroy my own financial future for you. You've confused my unconditional fatherly love with an unlimited line of credit and an endless tolerance for disrespect. And frankly, your assessment of my life has convinced me that you are not, in fact, ready for the privileged life I was providing. The silence that followed was heavy, crushing. She stood there, frozen, watching my face. The confusion was finally giving way to a sickening, dawning panic. Your rent wasn't paid this morning. The lease is in your name, not mine. Your car payment is already late, and the bank is going to call you about repossession later today. Your tuition for next semester is no longer secured, and your allowance is officially gone. You are on your own, Chloe. You have 2 hours, starting now, to pack up the few belongings you brought with you, call a cab or an Uber, and pay for it yourself, and get out of my pathetic house. You are fully and completely cut off. She laughed then, a short, sharp, disbelieving sound that lacked any genuine humor. You can't be serious, Dad. You're bluffing. You're not this man. You're too weak to follow through. I simply stood up, my posture straighter and taller than it had been in years, and walked around the table, not towards her, but towards the front door. Watch me, I said, my final words to her before I left the house. I got into my squeaking, 10-year-old Honda and drove to a nearby hardware store to buy new locks for the front and back doors, leaving her completely alone with the terrifying, immediate reality of my final, irrevocable decision. I needed the time away to steel my resolve against the inevitable emotional attack that was surely coming. I knew this was the hardest thing I had ever done, but it was the only way to save both of our futures. When I returned an hour later, the front door was unlocked, and she was gone. The relief was immediate and physical. I didn't have to face another confrontation right then. She had clearly stormed out in a fit of pride and disbelief, assuming I would call her back, begging her to return, once my initial anger subsided. I immediately set to work installing the new deadbolts and changing the key code on the garage door. The house felt strangely quiet, echoing with the unfamiliar sound of my own thoughts, unburdened by her demands. The immediate emotional fallout started 2 days later. The initial texts were pure, concentrated venom. You are the cruelest person I know. I hate you, and Mom was right to leave you. I'm going to tell your boss and everyone I know what a horrible, vindictive father you are. I read them all, a cold, protective shield around my heart. I did not respond. I knew engaging would only lead to manipulation and a return to the old, destructive patterns. Then came the phone calls starting late that night. The first few I let go to voicemail, listening only to the beginning of the messages, the familiar, desperate tone laced with tears and increasingly frantic pleas. She was claiming she couldn't afford groceries and that her landlord, an impersonal corporation, was already threatening eviction because her direct deposit hadn't come through. I had to be absolutely brutal with myself, forcing myself to hit the delete button without listening to the end. This was the hardest part, the emotional warfare she was so adept at waging. I finally answered one of her calls 4 days after the ultimatum. I picked up, said only, "Hello, Chloe," and waited. Her voice was thin, reedy, utterly devoid of the usual spoiled edge. It was the voice of a young woman tasting real fear for the first time. "Dad, please, I don't know what to do. My job, the car, they towed it from my old parking lot because the payment bounced. I can't even get to my new job, the minimum wage coffee shop job. I already used the money I earned last week for the deposit on a cheap, shared place way outside the city limits, but I'm going to be late on rent again, and my roommate is already furious." This was the truly shocking part, the first crack in her entitled facade. She had secured a job, a legitimate, minimum wage coffee shop job, something she swore just weeks earlier she would never do because it was beneath her and ruined her nails. I listened to her whole, panicked spiel, my heart aching with a pain so intense it felt physical, but my resolve remained steel hard. "I'm sorry, Chloe," I finally said, my voice quiet and neutral. "The consequences of bad financial planning and a lack of respect are harsh, I know. But you're smart. You're capable. You'll figure out the transportation. You'll figure out the rent. I have faith in your ability to survive this." Then, with a deep breath and a tightening of my grip on the phone, I hung up. I knew I couldn't stop the punishment midway. The lesson had to be total, final, and personally owned by her. I spent the rest of that evening alone, staring out the window, fighting the overwhelming urge to send her money, to rescue her. I didn't. I held the line. The silent war of attrition continued for 2 weeks. I heard nothing directly from her, but I saw evidence of her struggle on the margins. A Venmo request for $5 from an unfamiliar name that was a friend of hers, asking for help with a bus fare. A forwarded email from the university registrar about her delinquent account, which I promptly deleted. I was miserable, but I was also sleeping better, no longer plagued by the nightmares of financial ruin I had lived under for a decade. Then, 2 weeks after the car was towed, I received a certified letter from the city impound lot. Her sedan, the almost new vehicle I'd bought her, was going to be auctioned off in 48 hours to cover the accrued towing and storage fees. This was the point where the line I had drawn became fuzzy. Losing the car would be a devastating blow to her mobility and potential for self-sufficiency, stripping her of the one major asset she had. I knew, rationally, that she needed to keep the car to get to the job she now had. The lesson was about self-respect and work ethic, not total annihilation. I drove to the city, feeling a cold dread mixed with my grim determination. It felt like I was going to awake. I walked into the impound office, paid the exorbitant fees, nearly $1,000, and retrieved the car. I did not contact her. I drove it to a secure, long-term parking garage near her old university campus, a place I knew she was still familiar with. I paid for 6 months of guaranteed parking and then, instead of calling her, I drove home and typed a short, terse letter. It contained no sentiment, no accusation, just logistics. I included the garage key, the title to the car, now signed over completely to her, free and clear, and the receipt showing the payment was fully handled. The letter read, "The car is yours, free and clear. It is the last financial assistance you will receive from me until you earn the respect I deserve, Mark. The choice is now completely yours. Sell it and finance the next 2 years of your life, or use it to get to work and build your future. I love you, but I do not reward contempt. Figure it out." I mailed the package certified, return receipt requested. This was my final, conditional lifeline, a tool, not a handout that she would have to decide how to use. I knew that the full, final climax of this painful saga was still ahead, but for now, I had done all I could do to nudge her toward the only path that mattered. Independence. The weight of that final, certified letter leaving my hands felt like the physical severance of an umbilical cord that had been attached for 20 years. It was a lifeline, yes, but it was one that came with a price tag of absolute, non-negotiable independence. I spent the next 6 months in a state of agonizing, suspended animation, a grim emotional limbo. I had done the deed, and now I had to live with the terrifying uncertainty of the aftermath. Every time my phone rang with an unknown number, my stomach would drop, bracing for a desperate plea or, worse, a call from the police or a hospital. But the chaos I expected never fully materialized, at least not the visible, destructive chaos I had anticipated. The calls and texts from Chloe dwindled from daily, panicked pleas to 1 or 2 terse, transactional messages a month. They weren't asking for money anymore. They were usually about logistics, a question about a tax document I still had, or a demand for her birth certificate. I kept my responses strictly professional, cold, and brief. I was fighting the strongest instinct a father has, the urge to rescue his child. I was forced to remind myself daily that I wasn't watching her drown. I was watching her learn to swim in deep water for the first time. My own life, ironically, was beginning to flourish. The sudden, massive reduction in my monthly outgoings was immediately life-changing. I was no longer living paycheck to paycheck, the constant, gnawing anxiety gone. I could breathe again. I put a down payment on a small, charming condo closer to the city center, a place that was mine, without the ghosts of the old house. I finally took a risk at work, accepting a temporary, high-visibility project that involved more travel but also carried a significant bonus, something I would have instantly refused a year prior. I started dressing better, shedding the pathetic cargo shorts for actual trousers. I enrolled in a Spanish class, something I'd wanted to do since college. And then there was Diane. I met her in the Spanish class, a wonderful, vibrant woman who worked as an architect and, critically, appreciated my stability and my dry wit, not dismissed them. She was smart, successful, and saw the value in a steady, reliable man, a profound contrast to the contempt Chloe had shown. Our relationship was healthy, mature, and exhilarating, and it provided the emotional ballast I needed during this ongoing silent war with my daughter. For the first time in over a decade, my life was genuinely, authentically mine, and I was happy. But the happiness was always tinged with guilt and fear. What if I had broken her for good? What if I had pushed her too far, and she spiraled into something I couldn't pull her back from? I kept track of her silently. I knew she was still in the city, because the university forwarded me her semester schedule. She had somehow managed to remain enrolled. I knew she was living in a cheap, shared apartment outside the main campus area. And I knew, through a mutual family friend who saw her on the bus, that she was still working. The friend, a woman named Carol who didn't know the extent of our estrangement, commented, "Chloe looks tired, Mark, but she also looks serious." She was reading an economics textbook on the bus, not scrolling Instagram. That single observation gave me more hope than any desperate phone call ever could. It suggested that the shock therapy was actually forcing her to focus on substance over surface. I was awful. I didn't see you at all. I only saw your wallet and what you didn't have compared to my friend's parents. I was blind and selfish. I was working 3 jobs, the coffee shop, tutoring high school kids, and cleaning dorms on weekends, and my cheap laptop died, and I was going to fail a class, and I looked at my rent bill for the month, and I realized, her voice broke again, I realized what you did for 10 years. All that time. I was so exhausted and terrified after 1 week, and you did it for a decade, without complaint, without recognition. You weren't pathetic, Dad. You were the strongest person I knew, and I was too spoiled and stupid to see it. I sold the car.
I sold it, Dad.
I took the money and paid my tuition for this current semester, and I bought a cheap monthly bus pass. I'm going to graduate on time, and I got a scholarship to finish my senior year, not because of your money, but because I had to work my butt off for the grades. I did it. I did it on my own. She stepped forward, her body trembling with the weight of her confession, and she did something she hadn't done since she was a teenager. She hugged me. It was a real hug, desperate and full of genuine, hard-won remorse, a recognition of my sacrifice, not a demand for more. I held her tight, tears finally streaming down my face, wetting her shoulder. I knew, in that moment, the devastating trade-off had been worth it. I had lost an entitled, spoiled daughter, And in her place, I had found an honest, grateful, and capable woman. The immediate aftermath of that tearful, genuine apology was quiet, a profound silence that settled over my new condo, a silence utterly unlike the charged, suffocating quiet of the old house. The confrontation, the revenge, the big decision, it had all culminated not in a screaming match, but in a surrender. The surrender of her pride, and the surrender of my resentment. I held her tight, the mac and cheese forgotten on the counter, and I didn't say, "It's okay," because it hadn't been okay. I simply held her until her shaking subsided. When we finally pulled apart, her face was blotchy and swollen, but her eyes, those tired, honest eyes, held a clarity I had never seen before. "I owe you everything, Dad," she whispered, her voice still rough. "Not the money, I'll pay that back, but my life. You had to destroy the life you built for me to let me build my own." We spent the next 2 hours talking, really talking for the first time in maybe 5 years. Diane, sensing the gravity of the moment, stayed politely in the bedroom, a kindness I won't forget. Chloe told me everything. She detailed the sickening panic when the rent email bounced, the sheer terror of realizing her tuition was gone, and the blinding rage she felt when she saw my cold, typed letter with the car key. "I was going to throw the key in the river," she admitted, her voice low. "I was furious. I thought you were trying to hurt me. But then I looked at the bank account. I had less than $100, and I realized the car was the only thing standing between me and being homeless. That's when it hit me. You didn't leave me with nothing. You left me with a single, valuable asset and the tools of independence. You made me make a choice between status and survival." She explained how she spent days agonizing, but ultimately decided that selling the car was the only rational move. She took the proceeds, paid off her student debt balance, secured a cheap monthly bus pass, and put the rest aside for the next semester's rent deposit. The multiple jobs she took, the tutoring, the coffee shop, the dorm cleaning, weren't temporary. They were her new life. She even told me about the time her coffee shop boss yelled at her for spilling a latte, and how she bit her tongue and apologized, realizing that humiliation for a paycheck was just part of the bargain. "I used to think people who worked minimum wage were pathetic," she said, looking down at her rough, scarred hands. "Now I think they're heroes." I then told her my side, gently, without malice. I explained the decade of career stagnation, the fear that I wouldn't have enough for my own retirement, the deep, wounding pain of hearing my sacrifice dismissed as pathetic. I told her that her mother had left because she craved a big, exciting life, and that I, paradoxically, had created a life for Chloe that was so easy, so cushioned, that she ended up feeling the same contempt for me that Sarah had. It was a vicious, generational cycle of entitlement I was desperate to break. We both cried again, but this time, the tears felt cleansing, a genuine baptism of honesty. The consequences for everyone involved were profound and, in the end, overwhelmingly positive. For Chloe, the change was a total reset. She didn't return to the entitlement of her old life. She graduated on time with honors, but not because I paid for it, because she worked through her final year on 2 scholarships, the money from the car sale, and her multiple jobs. She developed a work ethic that impressed her professors and secured a fantastic entry-level marketing job, not through my old logistics connections, but through an internship she fought for and earned herself. She's now financially independent, humble, and her calls are never about money. They're about sharing her successes or, genuinely, asking how my life is going. She's a good woman, and she is the person I always hoped she would become. For me, the revenge, or rather, the reclamation, was equally therapeutic. The money I saved and redirected secured my retirement. I was able to purchase my condo and start a real life with Diane, who moved in 6 months after Chloe's apology. I still manage logistics, but now I do it with a sense of pride and autonomy, not resentment. I even took that high-visibility project Arthur had offered, which led to a legitimate, performance-based raise and a better title. The most satisfying consequence, however, was psychological. I finally shed the mantle of the pathetic provider. I became Mark, The man with his own life, his own hobbies, and his own dreams. The old house I had lived in, the one Chloe found so pathetic, was quickly sold, and the sale provided the final cushion I needed to be truly secure. It was a tangible end to the era of sacrifice. And for Sarah, Chloe's mother, the consequences were indirect but satisfyingly circular. She called Chloe after hearing about the big fight. It had, of course, gone through the grapevine, offering to help out and fix things, clearly trying to swoop in as the rescuing, glamorous parent. Chloe, however, shut her down immediately. "I don't need your help, Mom," she told her, in a voice I only heard about later. "I'm earning my own way. I was spoiled and miserable when Dad was paying for everything, and now I'm poor and proud. It turns out Dad was the one teaching me how to be successful." Sarah, who valued success and wealth above all else, was stunned into silence. It was the ultimate vindication. My daughter, independent and self-sufficient, finally recognizing the value of the quiet father over the brilliant, absent mother. My relationship with Chloe is now stronger than it ever was. It is built on mutual respect and shared honesty, not obligation or payment. I paid for a nice, non-extravagant graduation dinner, but I did not offer a gift. She accepted a small, formal loan for me to cover her new apartment deposit, which she insisted on signing a strict repayment contract for, paying me back every cent within 4 months of starting her job. The confrontation was painful, yes, but it was the necessary surgery to cut out a decade of toxic, unearned privilege and finally give my daughter the greatest gift of all, the knowledge that she could stand entirely on her own 2 feet. It wasn't revenge. It was the ultimate, tough love act of fatherhood, and it saved us both. The irony of this entire, brutal mess is that by calling me old and pathetic, my daughter inadvertently forced me to become the most interesting, most financially secure, and most genuinely respected version of myself I had ever been. Her cruel judgment was the catalyst that finally snapped me out of 2 decades of self-imposed, martyr-like stagnation. She stripped me bare of my all-consuming parental duties, and in doing so, I rediscovered my own identity, reclaimed my financial future, and found real, adult love with Diane, a woman who values the stability I built, not the fortune I didn't chase. And Chloe, in turn, learned a lesson that no textbook, no gentle lecture, and certainly no amount of my money could ever teach her: the profound, brutal value of self-reliance, respect, and the deep satisfaction of earned success. She learned that the greatest luxury isn't a designer handbag or a fast car. It's the quiet confidence that comes from knowing you can handle your own problems, pay your own bills, and stand firm against the world. Sometimes, the most loving, the most necessary thing a parent can do, especially when faced with entitlement, is to administer a dose of painful, immediate reality, even if it feels like cutting off a part of your own heart. The emotional cost was high, 6 months of agonizing silence and self-doubt, but the ultimate result was an adult daughter and a new, genuine relationship built on mutual respect and genuine affection, not financial obligation. It wasn't revenge. It was the ultimate, tough love act of fatherhood, and it was the only way to save both of us. My life is still modest by the standards of her college friends, but it is deeply, authentically mine, and for the first time, she sees the strength in that choice. She sees the stability, the sacrifice, and the commitment, not the lack of zeros in my bank account. The most shocking thing that happened after her cruel words wasn't my decision. It was her magnificent, hard-won transformation. Like this video if you were on my side, if you think I made the right, agonizing choice to cut her off and force her to grow up. Subscribe right now for more stories like this, where the real drama happens not on a huge stage, but right inside our own families behind closed doors. And please share your final, unvarnished thoughts on this whole mess in the comments section below. Did I go too far? Or was administering that painful dose of reality the only way to save her and myself? I need to know your take on this. I'll see you all in the next story.